Welcome to our podcast, GRC Explained Right. Yes, there are a lot of content out there when it comes to GRC. And yet, one of the surveys we did last year is an eye-opener for us, where a lot of people are still struggling to understand, where do I start GRC program? Where do I start when it comes to quantifying risk? So we started this podcast. We bring subject matter expert and industry leaders to talk about those tactical planning when it comes to GRC. So with me today, I have Mike Andrews. His service has been with DoD/DOW, government sector, recently based out of Vegas. Is that right, Andrew?
Yeah. I'm glad to be with you today, Dr. Manga. We're in Vegas. We work with companies throughout the U.S.
And tell me more about what does Justice do currently?
Yeah, so we help SMBs and some startups with their cybersecurity program in general, with a
Yeah,
focus on both risk and compliance. So kind of like right down the middle of the road because they're typically pretty small and
sure.
they want help with like both at once. Each company, they usually come for a specific reason, whether it's to help them close deals and get through those third-party checks, or maybe they had a close call, or maybe they had a scare or cyber incident of something like that, and then we just help
Right.
them improve.
I know a lot of times when the right time to implement GRC program or the actual funding comes in, or someone from the higher up executives are saying, hey, we need a program now. We need governance. It's usually either after a breach or incident or some sort of legislative enforcement. Have you ever seen in your career where it's coming out of where that the executives are saying we need to get better at this, either for our customers, for our clients, and we need a GRC? Like they have no enforcement. They don't need to prove to the government that they're doing everything right. They just want to do the right thing. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, I would say it's always for a reason other than they want to do it. I even made a LinkedIn post about that one time. Like, it's
Okay.
not like your local restaurant where they might get traffic because someone feels like having pizza. It's like they're doing it for a reason that's external. A lot of times, like you said, a law or regulation.
Right.
Last year, we even had one client that said they wanted to focus on the IRS guidelines for tax prep firms because they didn't want to go to jail. We were literally told that. I'm like, well, a guideline isn't a law, but it's good that they're taking it seriously for
Right.
whatever reason.
Yeah, and that also is a confusion. A lot of times, I have also heard like someone who's inheriting the GRC role or chief risk compliance sort of role, and they have not been in the industry. I have heard these myths as well, where hey, I need to be HIPAA compliant. I need to prove that next year, and it's an act at the end of the day. So, do you mind telling our audience what's the difference in an actual, let's say, PCI DSS, ISO, NIST versus HIPAA? Like, give us a little bit kind of two categories of, if you will, if I am trying to run a compliance program, what's the difference in ACT versus that the other side?
Yeah, that is important. A law, you have laws, regulations, lines, and then you have like voluntary standards, like ISO, like 27001, which is kind of broad cybersecurity. You have ISO 42001, which is focused on AI. Those aren't a law, right? So those are something that a company would do to get better at these areas in a way that is understandable to others, right? Because say you're evaluating our company. Do you want to ask us hundreds of questions, or do you want to say, have you been through ISO 27001 or SOC 2? And then if we say, yes, we've done both, you have a good understanding right away in less than 30 seconds, the type of things that we've done, right? And then you have guidelines, which could be given by, like I said earlier, like the IRS, or
Right.
maybe a school district, or it could be from a city, or if you're a public company, it might be from the Security and Exchange Commission. So really what we help companies do is figure out everything that applies to them and everything that they want to do, because some of those things like ISO 27001, it's not mandatory, but it could be good to do. And by figuring out everything that applies ahead of time, then you can build the cybersecurity program in a way that doesn't have all these silos, like
Right.
you don't want a new law to come out, like, "Oh, we need a 12th cybersecurity program." You want to make your cybersecurity program flexible enough to account for these things since they change pretty often.
And I think having something like ISO and again, some sort of framework from NIST it helps your tactical teams as well. So compliance is one thing. Internal auditor is going to prepare that. External is going to verify that. But having a framework like ISO, NIST, or any of the frameworks from CSA and ISECA, that helps the tactical team, the security teams to actually create a game plan how we're gonna go above and beyond. And one of the things, again, I want you to validate, I have heard repeatedly where if I have gone through HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, CCPA, you pick one, I don't need ISO because now I have gone through a little bit more stricter, if you will, the government enforced laws or acts. Is that true? Have you seen that in the industry or with your clients where if they would have to pick one or the other, they will always go with the legislative one and they'll just skip the guidance, if you will.
I would say it really varies because we've helped companies with PCI DSS,
Okay.
and the level to which a company has to do the PCI DSS varies depending on like how big they are, how many transactions they process, and it can be over like 400 controls. So if that's the one in question, it can be really good for you, but HIPAA, for example, it's a lot less prescriptive and it's more of a reactionary thing. It's not like you can't open your medical practice until the Office of Civil Rights within the government, who oversees HIPAA, comes
Right.
to you and says you're good to go. They focus more on like when either random checks or when something goes wrong, then they might start asking a lot of questions.
Right.
So, like, if you're in scope for PCI DSS, I think you could kind of make that the center of your efforts,
Yeah.
kind of, and still, as long as you're as to me, as long as you're finding the risk first, you're good to go. Because all compliance items are a form of risk. They're compliance risks, right? You could lose a lot of money if you don't comply. We've seen companies get big
Right.
fines, but not all cyber risks are compliance items. Yeah, so typically what we would do is we would recommend a company focus initially on a framework like the NIST cybersecurity framework,
Sure.
and then as they figure out all those other requirements like we talked about before, then they can kind of do a mapping and make sure they're tackling risk first, but all the other items are being accounted for as well.
Right. Right. 1%. All right. So let's double click on that part itself. So there's a different sort of cultures in organizations, risk avoidance, informed risk taking, um, transfer. We talk about that. But the first word is always risk. When you're working with organizations, customers, Mike, how do you help them actually define that risk? And I've seen the formal definitions, and yet I have seen every organization has their definition of what does risk mean to me and my organization and my business. How do you help them define that term? And then from there, avoidance, risk taking, transfer, whatever that means.
Yeah. So risk is the probability of something going wrong, and that could be within cybersecurity or not cybersecurity. So one of the first things I focus on is having the conversation to see whether they view cyber risk the same way they do the more obvious risks like economic risk or
Right.
competitive risk.
Right.
Because if they don't and they say something like, oh no, that's something for our IT person to handle, then we have to talk about that a little bit deeper. And then once we kind of get on the same page, then we could talk about figuring out the risk appetite for their business, meaning do they need to play things very conservatively,
Right.
even though it may cost more and take more time for whatever reason, maybe their industry, maybe the type of customers they serve, and also the types of risks that they really need to avoid, right? Like say they're super dependent on their systems and their system being down for like 1 hour would be a disaster.
Right.
Then we need to account for those type of risks more. And then with that, maybe if they deal with very sensitive data and a data breach would be a disaster, then we need to zoom in on those type of risks as well. And then we can kind of prioritize the aspects of cybersecurity that matter most to their business. Because like we talked about, risk should come before compliance.
Yeah.
Understanding the business should really come first before you even start looking at the risks. Because
Right.
as a practitioner, something I may think is important may not be that important in their case. Maybe if their systems are down for a month at a time because they're a farming business and they don't really care, then we have to account for those sorts of things.
100%. And I think that's kind of the step zero, if you will, in binary. Know your business before we start talking about anything other than that, right? Know
Yeah.
what we do. and
exactly.
what are the components that actually makes our business. And that's another thing, like from IT, security, GRC, that conversation comes first as a fundamental. So when we start evaluating risk, there is a qualitative, we all have seen those red, yellow, green, and there's a quantitative, which takes a lot of math, asking a lot of questions, which also takes something like a point metric, where how much does a breach cost me for this department today? And I will factor that. Maybe I'll get a budget. But now, 2 years later, if nobody's keeping up with it, it's really hard. It becomes stale, right? And the information will be wrong. So, when we talk about factor analysis of information risk, FAIR, or any other model for that matter, how can a team or even team leader who's inheriting GRC now start quantifying risk without getting bogged down in the math paralysis, if you will? Like, is there a streamlined way that you could suggest that, hey, if you want to quantify risk, don't start at the super micro level, start at the macro level so that you understand, you can quantify. And then I will also talk about the reporting to the higher ups and primarily the board. Let's talk about how to quantify risk without really getting into the math analysis paralysis.
Yeah, I would say the level of depth you go in this really needs to depend on the company you're at, because sometimes you might approach things at too shallow of a level. Meanwhile, if you're at a sophisticated company, and sometimes you may be at a company that isn't very advanced in quantifying their risk. And if you start at that advanced level, you risk losing the attention of people in the room, and then that's more likely to lead to inaction. So once you figure out the company you're at and their risk appetite, I always try to prefer to quantify things
Right?
and kind of like take more of a basic road and basic conversation initially, then get more in depth if I could see that they're tracking everything and there's a real benefit to getting
Sure.
more sophisticated. So I would say something like, what's your if you could share your revenue, if they're comfortable with that, like say we make 25 we bring in $25,000 a day in revenue. And you could say, well, how much of that depends on your systems? And they say, oh, basically all of it.
Right.
Okay, so I would think, all right, well, that's $25,000 a day, 750,000 a month. That's about $9 million a year, and then that allows me to, and also along with that, ask the number of data records they have. Right? Say they say here's our revenue. We have 5,000 data records per day. You have say here's our revenue per day. Here's our number of data records. So you can have some basic calculations, and then as you're doing your assessment, you can assign some maybe rough dollar values and probabilities to each of those risks coming to fruition. And then when you have your safeguards,
Sure.
once you have that information, then it's a lot easier to determine return on investment. And then that kind of opens the eyes for business leaders. But with this, it's important to be able to defend it, because anyone can come up with really rough math. And then if you're falling apart when the CFO asks for details, that's not good, because then they're going to stop listening. So
And
as
let's
long as
let
you,
and I
yeah,
do want to talk about that, Mike, where if you start quantifying risk with numbers and especially money, everybody pays attention. And that really opens up a conversation with, well, I got this data from Department X. They told me they rely upon systems to generate this revenue. Hence, I added that. When the other department will say, well, that's not true. But the support team will say, well, you didn't add me. Having a quantified risk assessment, as much as it brings the value, it also opens I think and that's something, again, it's I want you to validate, is that true or false, where it will open up a conversation that now every department is getting involved because there's money on the table now. Someone is actually putting numbers to it. Is that true? Have you seen that? Or is it more like, well, chief risk and compliance officer reported this and CEO or the board will approve it and off you go?
yeah, I think it is good to zoom in on the areas that are going to be more of a root cause issue, because that actually matters to their business, because it has to be something that the business cares about rightfully, not that we're convincing them to do something they shouldn't do just for
Right.
the sake of maybe getting more business. But also, as part of this, we need to be skeptical. Like say there's one department that maybe you're meeting with an accountant and they tell you some figures.
Yeah.
It's good to take those numbers, do some more interviews, both within the departments and with the executives, and kind of bounce it off numerous people. So if we're more skeptical in a healthy professional way,
Right.
then like the CFO is going to be, it's going to go well because you've already thought through those questions that a CFO, a COO, a CEO are likely going to ask. And when they know you've done that, they're more likely to listen, trust you, and take action.
One of my favorite topic is usually the KPIs, KRAs, metrics when it comes to GRC dashboards. What are the golden metrics that you would recommend your customers reporting up, influencing CEOs or decision makers that this is what you want to report? What are those golden things that you would suggest our audience that you make sure that you report those?
I would say, when possible, to try to leverage the existing ones within the company. Because if they have them, then a lot of times we don't need to really create many new ones. We just need to figure out where cybersecurity falls into that, right? Because cybersecurity for most businesses isn't the core thing that they do, right? Like no business says, "Oh, we want to get really big so we can spend a lot of money on cybersecurity,"
Right.
right?
100%.
So
That would be cool actually, but that would never happen.
at our business, it's like that. We're a cybersecurity company, but this is where our value as an advisor can get really valuable because we have to understand the technology, but we also need to understand the business. And sometimes we may understand business at a deeper level than some companies do. Maybe they're more focused on their products and services and they
100%.
haven't really thought about things from too deep of kind of like a core business perspectives. And if you say something to like, oh, well, what are your existing KPIs, your metrics, and they look around the room like, oh, we don't really have that,
Yeah.
then you could say, well, in general, even more than cybersecurity, it does help you to have that. We work with other companies and they have those sorts of things and it helps them grow. So that's something to
Right.
consider as well.
100%.
But if they don't have anything or they just say, well, what type of information should we be tracking? Some good ones are, I would say, the uptime, as we see a lot,
Sure.
and then just kind of like the risk posture of the company. So after we do the assessment, we can kind of figure out the best way to define that risk. If we can quantify it, great. Or if
Yeah.
maybe that doesn't work for whatever reason, then we just kind of go through another way. Some companies go with the maturity model, and you can do that. You don't have to do maturity model or risk scoring. Maybe you look at it in both cases, right? Like maybe at a program level and then per risk within the company, and then just give them the most straightforward way to track their risk and compliance over time. But of course, their
Yeah.
preferences play into this as well. A lot of times we shouldn't really be the ones suggesting things from scratch. We should be asking the questions to help them decide what's most important.
Right. Tag along with the business. Help them. At the end of the day, that's the name of the game. So let's wrap with this one, Mike.
Yeah.
AI has changed a lot of things, including the GRC world. And in some forums, there's also been said that the audit or the GRC consultant role is going to collapse because now companies can actually feed all the information about the risk and what they want into, let's just call this one tool, and ask them, what do I need to do? How far I'm from the compliance? What do I need to add into controls? Are you seeing that impact? That's my first question. Second, how are you as a consultant using AI to help your customers and clients as well to really like make, let's call them consultant plus plus. It's supercharging you and your skills and your talent with AI to help your clients and customers.
Yeah, this is important. And the positives of all these like GRC platforms is that more companies are thinking about compliance and ultimately that'll help their cybersecurity in general either way. And if they're able to have maybe their engineer use a platform, to me it's not the best, but it's better than nothing, right? So I think it's important to have both expertise and tools.
Sure.
It's kind of like buying a, s- a s- a Ferrari, for example, right? Like, okay, great. We
You
know
need a
that's
good
faster.
driver.
Yeah. So you want a driver. And yeah. So within our company, we're talking about this, because we do outreach and some companies will say, we're using this platform, so we don't need any help. So we
Right.
just, okay, fine. We want you to get the most out of it. So then we kind of talk about the benefits of having both expertise and the right tools. And for a while,
Sure.
we were even promoting something called a cybersecurity compliance double check. at our company to
Very
basically
nice.
say, okay, that's cool that
Makes sense.
you're using a platform like Vanta, but the thing is, those platforms aren't they don't know your company. You know, they're not an employee at your company. They're not someone that's come in and reviewed your company. So it
Right.
can only give you as good of support as the information you put in a lot of cases. So in that case, we were helping companies just double check things. And we've used a lot of these GRC platforms, and really none of them are perfect. But I don't think they're designed to be perfect. So if a company focuses on
100%.
having the expertise, using the right tools, and ultimately having assurance that whatever is happening in relation to that tool is correct, then that's the right way to do.
Right. And there's a whole legality concept of that as well that we're not going to touch here. When companies are considering AI, they also have to be mindful of like who's the ultimate accountable, liable, legally binding as well. So there's a whole aspect to that as well. But Mike, this has been super insightful, super useful, especially for those who are just getting into GRC. We touched upon a lot of different items, but I really love the part about how you would help people to define, quantify risk, and report all the way up. So thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Manga. Super happy to be here with you today.